Miss Marple and the Uninvited Eulogy. Miss Jane Marple sat in a wicker chair near the rose arbor, her sharp blue eyes taking in the scene, while her fingers worked steadily at her knitting. She had positioned herself, as always, where she could observe without appearing to do so, a skill perfected over decades of village life. The September sun cast dappled shadows through the ancient oak trees of Thornfield House, where Mrs. Beatrice Harrington's annual harvest garden party was in full swing. The cream of Mary Mead society had gathered on the immaculate lawn, their voices creating a pleasant hum that mingled with the clink of teacups and the distant sound of the church bells. Another cucumber sandwich, Miss Marple? Mrs. Harrington swooped down upon her, resplendent in lavender silk that rustled with every movement. At 62, Beatrice Harrington still carried herself like the London debutante she had once been, though 30 years in Mary Mead had softened some of her edges. "How kind, but no thank you, dear," Miss Marple replied, her needles never pausing. "Such a lovely party. You've outdone yourself again," Mrs. Harrington preened slightly. "Well, one does one's best. Though I must say, the new caterers from Much Benham are not quite up to standard. Did you notice the scones are rather dry?" Miss Marple made a non-committal sound, her attention caught by a small drama unfolding near the refreshment table. Young Timothy Bellingham, though at 35, he was hardly young anymore, stood rigid as his wife Julia whispered urgently in his ear. His face had gone quite pale, and he kept glancing toward the French doors leading into the house. "Of course," Mrs. Harrington continued, oblivious to Miss Marple's distraction, "one can't expect London standards in the countryside, though when dear Charles was alive, we always—" She broke off as a figure appeared in the doorway of Thornfield House. The conversation on the lawn faltered, then died entirely as the guests turned to stare. "Good God," someone whispered. "Is that— It can't—" The man who emerged onto the terrace was perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair and the kind of deeply tanned skin that suggested years in warmer climates. He wore a well-cut but slightly dated suit, and there was something in his bearing, a certain stillness, a watchful quality that made Miss Marple's fingers pause in their work. Mrs. Harrington had gone very still, her face draining of color beneath her carefully applied rouge. The teacup in her hand trembled, sending a spray of Earl Grey across her lavender silk. The stranger surveyed the frozen tableau before him, with what might have been amusement. Then he descended the steps with deliberate slowness, his eyes fixed on their hostess. "Hello, Beatrice," he said, and his voice carried clearly across the silent garden. "I don't suppose you were expecting me, though I did always say I'd return for your harvest party one day." "Martin," Mrs. Harrington breathed, and the teacup slipped from her nerveless fingers to shatter on the flagstones. "But we thought you were—" The silence stretched taut as a piano wire. Miss Marple noticed how certain guests had begun to edge away, while others pressed closer with the avid curiosity of those who scent scandal. She saw Julia Bellingham grip her husband's arm hard enough to wrinkle his jacket. She saw Colonel Bantry's hand move unconsciously to where his service revolver would once have been. She saw the Reverend Julian Harcourt close his eyes as if in prayer. Dead? Martin Ashford, for that was clearly who he was, smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, I'm sure you did. How terribly inconvenient for everyone that I'm not." But most interesting of all, she saw the expression that flickered across the face of young Rosemary Sinclair, the Harringtons' ward. Not surprise, but something that looked remarkably like triumph. "I suppose," Martin Ashford continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled company, "I should apologize for interrupting your charming party. But you see, I've come home to claim what's mine, and to settle some old debts." A nervous titter ran through the crowd, as if someone had made a poor joke that no one quite understood. But Miss Marple, watching from her chair by the roses, saw the fear in too many eyes to mistake Martin Ashford's words for anything but what they were, a threat. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had hardened. "I do hope you'll all forgive me if I say that some of you here today have been living on borrowed time. That time, I'm afraid, has just run out." Or perhaps she thought, as she resumed her knitting with steady hands. A promise. The party, needless to say, broke up soon after. Guests murmured hasty excuses and fled to their cars, leaving Mrs. Harrington standing alone on her perfect lawn, staring at the man who had returned from the dead to shatter her carefully ordered world. Miss Marple was among the last to leave, taking her time to gather her knitting and thank her hostess. As she passed Martin Ashford, still standing like a dark monument among the abandoned chairs and tables, she paused. "Welcome home, Mr. Ashford," she said mildly. "Though I must say, your timing is rather dramatic. In my experience, surprise appearances at social gatherings rarely end well." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or recognition of a different sort of danger than he had expected to find in this sleepy village. "You're right, of course," he said slowly. "But then I've never been one for subtle entrances." "No," Miss Marple agreed, her blue eyes twinkling. "I can see that. Such a pity. Subtlety can be so much more effective, don't you think?" She didn't wait for an answer, but continued on her way, leaving Martin Ashford staring after her with a slight frown between his brows. As she walked home through the village, Miss Marple reflected on the afternoon's events. Martin Ashford, whom everyone had believed dead these 15 years. His return would certainly set the cat among the pigeons, as her nephew Raymond would say, but there had been something else in the air at Thornfield House, something that had preceded Martin's appearance. She thought of Timothy Bellingham's pale face, of the Reverend's closed eyes, of Rosemary Sinclair's strange expression of triumph. Yes, there were secrets here, old ones and new ones, all tangled together like a skein of wool that had been left too long in a drawer. By the following morning, news of Martin Ashford's return had spread through St. Mary Mead like spilled ink on blotting paper. The village shop, usually a sedate establishment presided over by the perpetually disapproving Mrs. Emmett, buzzed with speculation and half-remembered scandals. Miss Marple smiled to herself. How fortunate that she had always been rather good at untangling knots. Miss Marple arrived at 9:30, ostensibly in need of darning wool, and found the shop fuller than usual. Mrs. Price Ridley held court near the biscuit tins, her voice carrying with its customary authority. "Well, I always said there was something peculiar about his disappearance," she announced to her captive audience. "A man doesn't simply vanish in Africa without leaving some trace. Mark my words, Beatrice Harrington knows more than she's ever let on." "But surely," ventured Miss Weatherby, clutching a tin of throat lozenges, "if he's been alive all this time, why return now, after 15 years? "Money," declared Colonel Bantry, who had wandered in from the post office. "It's always about money in the end. The Ashford estate must be worth a pretty penny by now, what with all the development in the area." "I heard," said young Mrs. Clement, the doctor's wife, lowering her voice conspiratorially, that Martin Ashford was mixed up in some rather unsavory business before he left. "Something to do with forged paintings, wasn't it?" Miss Marple selected her wool with careful attention, appearing entirely absorbed in matching shades of blue. But her ears missed nothing. "Shot himself," the colonel supplied grimly. "Right after Martin disappeared. Suspicious timing, if you ask me." Miss Marple moved quietly to the counter, where Mrs. Emmett rang up her purchase, with thin-lipped disapproval of the gossiping crowd. "Forgeries," Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "That was never proved. Though I grant you, his associates were not what one would call respectable. That dreadful man from London, what was his name? Carstairs? He came to a bad end, I recall." "Terrible business," Mrs. Emmett muttered. "That poor Mrs. Harrington, having to face such a shock, and at her age too." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though Mrs. Harrington has always been remarkably resilient. I remember when her husband died so suddenly, she bore up wonderfully." Mrs. Emmett's eyes sharpened. "That's right, you were there when Mr. Charles collapsed, weren't you, Miss Marple? Heart attack, wasn't it?" She left the shop with her wool, but instead of heading home, she took the longer route past the vicarage. The Reverend Julian Harcourt was in his garden, supposedly tending to his prized dahlias, but his movements were mechanical, his mind clearly elsewhere. "So," the doctor said. Miss Marple counted out her change precisely, though it was all rather unexpected. Charles Harrington had always seemed quite robust. "Good morning, Vicar," Miss Marple called cheerfully. He started violently, dropping his secateurs. "Oh, Miss Marple, good morning. That is, I was just—" "Such beautiful flowers," she said, joining him by the garden gate. though they'll need bringing in soon. I expect. The first frost can't be far off. Yes, yes, quite right. He retrieved his secateurs with shaking hands. Miss Marple, I wonder, you were at the Harringtons yesterday. This business with Martin Ashford, quite dramatic, she agreed. You knew him before he left, didn't you? The vicar's face, already pale, seemed to lose what little colour remained. We were acquainted. He was, that is to say, he attended church occasionally. Not what you'd call a regular parishioner. No, I imagine not. Still, 15 years is a long time. People change. Do they? The question burst from him with surprising vehemence. Do they really, Miss Marple? Or do they simply become more skilled at hiding what they truly are? Before she could respond, he had turned and hurried back to the vicarage. Leaving his dahlias forgotten, Miss Marple continued her walk, her expression thoughtful. At the corner of Vicarage Lane, she encountered Dr. Clement emerging from the Bellingham's cottage, his medical bag in hand, and a frown creasing his pleasant face. Good morning, Doctor. I hope no one is seriously ill? Dear me. And will they? What? Oh, good morning, Miss Marple. No, nothing serious. Mrs. Bellingham had one of her nervous attacks. All this excitement yesterday, he shook his head. Between you and me, I've had to prescribe sedatives. She was quite hysterical last night, apparently. Kept insisting they had to leave the village immediately. Timothy's put his foot down for once. Says he can't leave his position at the bank without proper notice. Quite right, too. Can't have people fleeing the village every time there's a bit of gossip. He hurried off to his next patient, leaving Miss Marple to continue her perambulation. She was nearing the high street when a sleek black car purred past, slowing as it approached Thornfield House. Through the window, she glimpsed Martin Ashford's distinctive profile. Curious, she adjusted her route to take her past the Harrington estate. The gate stood open, and as she drew near, she heard voices raised in anger. Have no right. That was Beatrice Harrington, her cultured tones sharp with fury. This is my home now. Charles left it to me, and nothing you can say or do will change that. How dare you? Charles earned every penny. Your home? Martin's laugh was unpleasant. Built with whose money, Beatrice? Maintained with whose fortune? You've been living on theft for 15 years. There was a crash, as of china breaking, and then Rosemary Sinclair's voice, high and frightened. Please, Aunt Beatrice. Mr. Ashford, the servants will hear. Charles earned nothing. Charles took what wasn't his and dressed it up in respectability. But I know the truth, and soon everyone else will too. Let them hear. Martin's voice rose. Let the whole village hear. I've kept silent long enough. Miss Marple walked on, her pace unhurried, but her mind was working rapidly. The past, it seemed, was not nearly as dead and buried as St. Mary Mead had believed. And if Martin Ashford had his way, it would soon be exhumed for all to see. How interesting, Miss Marple thought. Dr. Clement had said Timothy refused to leave the village, yet here he was, apparently doing just that, and without his wife. She had just reached her own gate, when she spotted a familiar figure hurrying along the lane. Timothy Bellingham, who should have been at the bank at this hour, was walking rapidly in the direction of the railway station, a small valise in his hand, and his face set in lines of determination. She went inside to put away her wool, but her thoughts remained on the morning's encounters. The village was reacting to Martin Ashford's return like a disturbed anthill. Everyone scurrying in different directions, everyone guarding their own secrets. In her experience, when people were this frightened, when old secrets threatened to surface, violence was rarely far behind. The only questions were, who would strike first, and who would be the victim? As she settled into her favorite chair by the window, taking up her knitting once more, Miss Marple had the uncomfortable feeling that she wouldn't have to wait long for answers. The autumn sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the peaceful village. But peace, Miss Marple knew, was often just another word for the calm before the storm. The Thursday Morning Post brought an unexpected invitation to Miss Marple. Afternoon tea at Thornfield House, written in Beatrice Harrington's elegant script. The note was brief, almost curt. Do come at 4. I find myself in need of sensible company. B.H. Miss Marple arrived promptly, finding the drawing room much changed from the gay atmosphere of the garden party. The curtains were half drawn against the afternoon sun, casting the room in a melancholy twilight. Beatrice Harrington sat rigid in a high-backed chair, her face showing every one of her 62 years. "How kind of you to come," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite. "I suppose you think me foolish, inviting you here after that dreadful scene yesterday." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, settling herself comfortably. "In times of trouble, one needs friends more than ever." Beatrice's laugh was brittle. "Friends? I wonder how many friends I have left, now that Martin has returned with his accusations." The tea service arrived, wheeled in by a nervous-looking maid who kept glancing toward the door as if expecting Martin Ashford to materialize. When she had gone, Beatrice poured with hands that trembled slightly. "You must wonder why I asked you here," she began, then stopped, seeming to gather herself. "The truth is, Miss Marple, I need advice from someone with a clear head, someone who understands human nature." Miss Marple sipped her tea and waited. In her experience, people told you things in their own time, and pushing rarely helped. Martin has always believed, that Charles cheated him out of his inheritance. The words came in a rush. It's nonsense, of course. When their father died, the estate was practically bankrupt. Charles saved it through clever investments, hard work. Martin was in London, playing at being an art dealer, spending money he didn't have, mixing with questionable people. Beatrice's mouth tightened. He expected Charles to simply hand over half of everything, despite having done nothing to earn it. And Martin, "I see." And when Charles refused, they quarreled terribly. Martin made wild accusations, said Charles had hidden assets, falsified accounts. He even suggested. She paused, color flooding her cheeks. "He implied that I had influenced Charles, as if I were some sort of fortune hunter." Miss Marple set down her teacup gently. "And then Martin went to Africa." "Yes, some scheme about importing tribal art. We heard nothing for 2 years, and then word came that he died. Fever, they said. His business partner sent a death certificate, such as it was. We mourned him, despite everything." Beatrice started. "How did you—" "Yes, Oliver Carstairs, a thoroughly unpleasant man. He came here once, after Martin's supposed death, wanting money. Said Martin had owed him. Charles sent him away with a flea in his ear. His business partner was that Mr. Carstairs. Suicide, or so they said." Beatrice's voice dropped. "Miss Marple, I must tell someone. The night before Carstairs died, he telephoned Charles. I don't know what was said, but Charles was white as a sheet afterward. He locked himself in his study and wouldn't come out until morning. And Mr. Carstairs later died himself, I believe." The door opened suddenly, making both women jump. Rosemary Sinclair peered in, her pretty face anxious. "I'm sorry, Aunt Beatrice. I didn't know you had company. I was just looking for my sketching pad." "Third drawer of the bureau, where it always is," Beatrice said sharply. "Really, Rosemary, you're getting quite scattered lately." The girl retrieved her pad and hurried out, but not before Miss Marple noticed the quick, frightened glance she cast toward the window, overlooking the drive. "Poor child," Beatrice sighed. "This is all very hard on her. She's been with us since she was 12, you know. Her parents died in that train crash, and Charles insisted we take her in. She was his goddaughter." "Yes, though I sometimes wonder," Beatrice trailed off, then seemed to shake herself. "But that's neither here nor there. Miss Marple, what am I to do about Martin? He's staying at the Crown and Anchor, holding court, spreading his poison. This morning he was at the bank, asking questions about Charles's accounts from 15 years ago. A fortunate girl, to have such generous guardians." "The bank where Timothy Bellingham works?" "Yes, though Timothy was conveniently absent today. Sudden illness, they said." Beatrice's tone suggested what she thought of that excuse. Miss Marple was forming another question when they heard footsteps in the hall, firm, deliberate footsteps that could belong to only one person. Martin Ashford appeared in the doorway without waiting to be announced. "This is my house," Beatrice said coldly. "You're not welcome here." "Ah, the tea party continues," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "How cozy. Mind if I join you, sister-in-law? Your house? We'll see about that." He turned to Miss Marple with exaggerated courtesy. "I don't believe we were properly introduced yesterday. Martin Ashford, back from the dead."
Jane Marple,
She replied calmly, "And I must say, you look remarkably well for someone who's been dead for 15 years. He laughed, a genuine sound this time. "I like you, Miss Marple. No pretense, no silly gasping and hand-wringing. Just straight to the point. At my age, one hasn't time for gasping and hand-wringing. Though I am curious about your resurrection."
are you?
"Then you're the only one in this village who is. Everyone else seems rather put out by it." He helped himself to a chair, ignoring Beatrice's outraged expression. "Would you like to hear the truth? The real truth, not the fairy tale my dear sister-in-law has no doubt been spinning. Martin, I won't have you." "Won't have me what?" "Speaking frankly, too late for that, Beatrice." He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Miss Marple. "I never went to Africa for any business scheme. I went because Charles paid me to go, paid me to disappear and stay disappeared." "That's a lie." Beatrice was on her feet, her face flushed. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Beatrice sank back into her chair, suddenly looking very old. "Is it? Then why did he send money every month to a bank in Cape Town?" "Oh yes, I know all about that account, just as I know about the paintings." Martin's smile was wolfish. "The ones that made Charles's fortune, the ones that were sold as genuine, but were nothing of the sort. My brother, you see, had a talent, not for business, whatever Beatrice claims. His talent was for copying the masters so well that even experts were fooled." "You can't prove anything," Beatrice whispered. "What paintings?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "I didn't know," Beatrice said finally, her voice barely audible. "About the paintings. I swear to you, I didn't know. Can't I? I have letters, Beatrice, letters from Carstairs, discussing the whole operation. Letters that Charles thought were destroyed when Carstairs conveniently killed himself." He stood, brushing imaginary dust from his jacket. "But we'll discuss that later, in private, unless you'd prefer I make it all public." He strode out, leaving silence in his wake. Beatrice sat frozen, staring at nothing, while Miss Marple quietly poured fresh tea. Miss Marple studied her hostess's ravaged face. "But you suspected—" A long pause, then, almost imperceptibly, Beatrice nodded. "After Charles died, I found things, documents, bills of sale that didn't quite match. I burned them." She looked up, defiance flickering in her eyes. He was dead. What good would it have done to destroy his reputation? "I continued them. What else could I do? But I swear, Miss Marple, I thought he was dead. That money went to a charity in Cape Town, an orphanage. I checked. And Martin's monthly payments." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yet someone was cashing those payments. Someone who knew about the arrangement. But who? And why let me go on believing?" Beatrice stopped, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Oh God, you don't think, all this time, someone has been—" She never finished the sentence. From somewhere in the house came a crash, followed by a scream. High, terrified and abruptly cut off. Both women rose as one, but it was Miss Marple who reached the door first, moving with surprising speed for a lady of her years. In the hall, they found Rosemary Sinclair standing at the foot of the stairs, her sketching pad scattered on the floor, one hand pressed to her mouth. "In the study," she gasped. "Oh God, in the study." Martin Ashford sat in the chair where his brother had once worked, his head thrown back, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. A knife protruded from his chest, an ornate letter opener that Miss Marple recognized as part of the desk set. Miss Marple didn't wait for more. She hurried down the hall to Charles Harrington's former study, now used as a library. The door stood ajar, and through it, she could see a figure slumped over the desk. Then she saw it. Clutched in Martin's right hand was a piece of paper torn from a notebook. On it, in pencil, someone had written a single word: fake. She moved closer, careful not to disturb anything, and confirmed what she had known from the moment she saw him. Martin Ashford, who had returned from the dead only days before, was now indisputably deceased. Behind her, she heard Beatrice's sharp intake of breath, Rosemary's renewed sobbing. But Miss Marple's attention was fixed on the scene before her. Something about it troubled her, something beyond the obvious horror of murder. Martin Ashford had come home to expose old secrets and settle old scores. Now he was dead, silenced before he could reveal whatever truths he had carried for 15 years. But whoever had killed him had been careless, or perhaps deliberate, in leaving that single word behind. As the sound of running feet announced the arrival of the servants, as Beatrice fumbled for the telephone to call the police, Miss Marple stood quite still, her mind already working through the possibilities. Fake. But what was fake? The paintings? Martin's death in Africa? Or something else entirely? Something that went deeper than anyone in St. Mary Mead had yet imagined. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, his face set in its customary expression of irritation mixed with self-importance. He was followed by Constable Briggs and Dr. Haydock, who confirmed what was already obvious. Martin Ashford had been dead for approximately 30 minutes, killed by a single thrust of the letter opener between the ribs. As sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, Miss Marple knew that finding the answer to that question would be the key to catching a murderer. Right then, Inspector Slack announced, surveying the assembled household with suspicion. "Nobody leaves until I've questioned everyone. Mrs. Harrington, I'll need a list of everyone who was in the house." "Well," Beatrice hesitated. "The Reverend Mr. Harcourt called earlier, around 2 o'clock, and I believe I saw Timothy Bellingham in the garden, though he didn't come in." Beatrice, who had recovered some of her composure, straightened in her chair. "There was myself, Miss Marple, my ward Rosemary, the cook Mrs. Davies, and the housemaid Jenny. Oh, and Tompkins the gardener, though he was outside. That's all? Nobody else came or went?" "I couldn't say. I saw him from the morning room window, talking to Rosemary near the rose garden. They seemed to be arguing." Inspector Slack's eyes sharpened. "Bellingham? What was he doing here?" Miss Marple, who had been permitted to remain as she had discovered the body, noticed how Rosemary's face drained of color at this revelation. "Miss Sinclair," the inspector rounded on the girl. "What was Timothy Bellingham doing here?" He, Rosemary twisted her hands together. "He wanted to warn me about Mr. Ashford. He said Mr. Ashford had been asking questions at the bank, trying to access old records. And you argued about this? I see." Inspector Slack made a note. "And where is Mr. Bellingham now?" Tim was frightened. "He wanted me to convince Aunt Beatrice to pay Mr. Ashford whatever he wanted, to make him go away. I told him that was impossible. I don't know. He left when Mr. Ashford arrived." "Ashford saw him?" Rosemary nodded miserably. "They passed each other at the gate. Mr. Ashford said something. I couldn't hear what, and Tim went white as a sheet and practically ran away." The inspector turned his attention to the servants, but learned little. Jenny had been in the kitchen with Cook, preparing dinner. Neither had seen or heard anything until Rosemary's scream. Tompkins, brought in from the garden, was equally unhelpful, though he did mention seeing that Bellingham fellow leaving in a hurry. "Now then, Mrs. Harrington." Inspector Slack fixed his stern gaze on Beatrice. "Tell me about this brother-in-law of yours. Why did everyone think he was dead?" "So he claimed your late husband was an art forger, and you say you knew nothing about it." Beatrice repeated the story she had told Miss Marple, though with obvious reluctance when it came to Martin's accusations about the paintings. The inspector's expression grew increasingly skeptical. "Destroying evidence, Mrs. Harrington? I told you, I found some papers after Charles died that seemed irregular, but I destroyed them. There seemed no point in pursuing it." "Evidence of what?" "Charles was dead. Martin was supposedly dead. Who would it have helped to drag up ancient scandals?" Miss Marple, observing quietly from her corner, noticed how Beatrice's hands clenched in her lap, how her eyes darted toward the door as if calculating escape routes. The inspector noticed too. "You had quite a motive for wanting Martin Ashford to stay dead, didn't you? He threatened your comfortable life here, your reputation, everything." "Inspector," Miss Marple interjected mildly, "might I point out that Mrs. Harrington was with me in the drawing room when the murder occurred? We heard the crash together." Inspector Slack looked annoyed at the interruption. "Yes. Well, we only have your word for the exact timing, don't we? The doctor said death could have occurred any time in a 30-minute window." "Sir, "We found Mr. Bellingham. He was at the railway station, trying to buy a ticket to London." "Really, Inspector?" Beatrice began hotly, but was interrupted by Constable Briggs appearing in the doorway. While they waited, Miss Marple took the opportunity to study the room's other occupants. Rosemary sat huddled in her chair, arms wrapped around herself as if cold. Every few moments, her eyes would dart toward the window, then away again. Beatrice maintained her rigid posture, but a muscle twitched in her jaw, betraying her tension. Was he now? Inspector Slack's smile was grim. "Bring him in, Constable. Let's see what he has to say for himself." The servants, dismissed to the kitchen but told not to leave, could be heard whispering anxiously. Through the half-open door, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Jenny, the housemaid, crying into her apron while Cook patted her shoulder. "Then why were you running?" Inspector Slack demanded. Timothy Bellingham, when he was brought in, looked like a man who had aged 10 years in an afternoon. His usual neat appearance was disheveled, his tie askew, his face grey with fear. "I didn't do it," he said before anyone could speak. "I know how it looks, but I didn't kill him." "What money, Mr. Bellingham?" "Because I knew you'd think." "Because of the money." Timothy sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "Oh, God, Julia said this would happen. She said he'd come back one day." Timothy looked up, his eyes haunted. 15 years ago, I was junior clerk at the bank. Mr. Charles Harrington asked me to handle some transfers, large sums, to a Swiss account. I was young, ambitious. I didn't ask questions. Transfers from where? But Martin Ashford knew different. Various sources, sales of paintings, mostly. I processed the paperwork, made sure everything looked legitimate. In return, Mr. Harrington helped my career, promoted me. I thought it was just tax avoidance, maybe a bit shady but not illegal. Timothy nodded miserably. He came to the bank yesterday, knew exactly which transactions to ask about. He had dates, amounts, even reference numbers. He said he could prove the paintings were forgeries, that the money was proceeds of fraud. He said, unless I helped him access Charles's old records, he'd go to the police, tell them I was complicit. No, to beg Rosemary to intercede. I thought maybe she could talk to him, make him see reason, but then he arrived while I was still here, and the way he looked at me, Timothy shuddered. I knew it was hopeless. So yes, I ran, but I didn't kill him. So you came here today, to what? Threaten him? It's for you, Inspector, she said, holding out the receiver. It's about Mr. Ashford's room at the Crown and Anchor. Inspector Slack was preparing another question when the telephone rang shrilly. Beatrice answered it, her face growing even paler as she listened. The inspector took the phone, his expression darkening as he listened. When he hung up, his face was grim. Miss Marple, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. Inspector, might I ask about the paper in Mr. Ashford's hand? The one with fake written on it? It seems Mr. Ashford's room has been ransacked. The landlord discovered it an hour ago. Papers everywhere, luggage torn apart. He fixed his gaze on each suspect in turn. Someone was looking for something. The question is, did they find it before or after they killed Martin Ashford? What about it? Well, it strikes me as odd. If Mr. Ashford wrote it as he was dying, why? What message was he trying to leave? And if the murderer wrote it, why leave such a clue? Inspector Slack waved this away. Probably grabbed it in his death throes, or maybe he was writing something when he was attacked. The point is, we have clear motives and opportunity. Mrs. Harrington wanted to protect her reputation and fortune. Bellingham wanted to avoid prison. Even Miss Sinclair here might have reasons we don't know about yet. I would never, Rosemary began, but Beatrice cut her off. Inspector, this is intolerable. You're treating us all like criminals. I insist you allow Miss Marple to leave, at least. She has nothing to do with any of this. On the contrary, Miss Marple said pleasantly, I believe I might be helpful. You see, Inspector, I couldn't help but notice something curious about the study when we found the body. Oh yes, the inspector's tone was patronizing. And what would that be? The window was open, just a crack, but definitely open. And yet Mrs. Harrington is quite particular about keeping windows closed in rooms that aren't in use. She mentioned it just this afternoon, how the dampness ruins the books. Everyone turned to look at Beatrice, who frowned. "You're right. That window should have been closed. I check them every morning myself," suggesting, Miss Marple continued, that someone might have entered or left through that window. "The study is on the ground floor, after all, with convenient access from the terrace." Inspector Slack grudgingly made a note. "We'll check for signs of entry. Though, I still say the killer is right here in this room." As if to emphasize his point, he turned to Rosemary. "Miss Sinclair, you discovered the body. What were you doing in that part of the house?" I was looking for Mr. Ashford. To apologize." "Apologize for what?" Rosemary glanced at Beatrice, then away. "For being rude earlier. When he was talking to Aunt Beatrice and Miss Marple, I was listening at the door. He caught me, and was quite angry. I thought if I apologized, it might make things easier for everyone." "So you went to the study?" "I saw the door ajar, and thought he might be in there. When I pushed it open," she shuddered, "he was just sitting there, with that thing in his chest, staring at nothing." Miss Marple noticed something the inspector seemed to miss. The slight emphasis Rosemary placed on sitting there, as if this detail particularly disturbed her. "Well," Inspector Slack announced, "I'll need formal statements from all of you down at the station. Nobody leaves the village without permission. Mrs. Harrington, I'll have to seal the study until the forensics men can go over it properly." As the inspector bustled about giving orders, Miss Marple caught Dr. Haydock's eye. The doctor, an old friend, sidled over to her. "Well, Jane, what do you make of it?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that there's more to this than a simple case of silencing an inconvenient relative. That word fake troubles me. Could mean anything. The forgeries, Martin's death in Africa, or something else entirely." Miss Marple gathered her knitting. "Tell me, doctor, in your medical opinion, would a man stabbed through the heart have time to write anything?" Dr. Haydock frowned. "Depends on the exact placement. If the blade hit the heart directly, death would be almost instantaneous. But if it missed by a fraction, he might have had a few seconds." Miss Marple didn't answer directly. "I think I'll have a word with the Reverend Mr. Harcourt tomorrow. He was here earlier, and he's been behaving very strangely since Martin's return. Possibly. Why?" As she took her leave, she paused at the door for one last look at the assembled suspects. Each face told its own story of fear, guilt, or grief. But which emotion, she wondered, belonged to the murderer? Unless, of course, someone was determined to ensure it came to light anyway. And that, Miss Marple thought, might be the most dangerous person of all. Outside, the September evening was drawing in, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. As Miss Marple walked home, she reflected on the afternoon's events. Martin Ashford had returned to expose the truth about his brother's fortune. Now he was dead, and that truth might have died with him. She found the Reverend Julian Harcourt in his study, but he was not alone. Mrs. Julia Bellingham sat opposite him, her face blotched with tears, twisting a damp handkerchief between her fingers. The next morning dawned grey and drizzling, matching the sombre mood that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, despite a restless night spent puzzling over the previous day's events, was up early and making her way to the vicarage by 9 o'clock. "Oh," Mrs. Bellingham started up. "Miss Marple, I was just leaving." "Please don't go on my account," Miss Marple said gently. "I can come back later." No, I must get home. Timothy will be wondering." She gathered her things hastily, but not before Miss Marple noticed the envelope she tucked into her purse, an envelope bearing what looked like foreign stamps. When she had gone, the vicar gestured wearily to the vacated chair. "Do sit down, Miss Marple, though I'm afraid I'm poor company this morning." Mrs. Bellingham seemed distressed. "About the financial arrangements?" "Yes. This business with Martin Ashford, it stirred up things better left buried." He rubbed his face with both hands. "She came to ask my advice about whether Timothy should confess everything to the police." The vicar looked up sharply. "You know about that? Mr. Bellingham mentioned it yesterday, after Mr. Ashford was found." The vicar slumped in his chair. "Poor Timothy. He was so young then, so eager to please. Charles Harrington could be very persuasive when he chose." Miss Marple studied the vicar's haggard face. "You knew Charles well, Actually, Miss Marple said carefully, I rather think ancient history is exactly what I need to understand. You see, Mr. Harcourt, I can't help feeling that Martin Ashford's murder is rooted in the past, and you were there when it all began. We were at school together. He was brilliant, you know. Could have been a great artist in his own right. Instead, he trailed off, then seemed to collect himself. But you didn't come here to listen to ancient history. The vicar was quiet for so long that Miss Marple wondered if he would speak at all. Finally, he rose and went to a cabinet, returning with a small leather-bound book. This is my journal from 15 years ago, he said, handling it as if it might burn him. I've been reading it since Martin returned, trying to understand where it all went wrong. He opened it to a marked page. Here, September 15th, the day before Martin supposedly left for Africa. I wrote, Maine came to the church tonight. Very agitated. Said C had given him an ultimatum. Leave the country or face exposure. When I asked exposure of what, he laughed bitterly and said, I of all people should know, but I don't know, and that's what frightens me. Miss Marple leaned forward. You of all people? Why would he say that? The vicar closed the journal with shaking hands. Because I performed a service for Charles, years before, a private blessing ceremony. Very private, very quiet. He said it was for some valuable items he'd acquired, wanted God's blessing on his good fortune. I thought it harmless, if eccentric. What sort of items? Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. And you think now they were forgeries, paintings, a collection of Renaissance works he said he'd bought from a dealer in financial difficulties. Beautiful pieces, a supposed Botticelli, a Titian sketch. He donated one to the church later. It still hangs in the vestry. I don't know what to think, but Martin's reaction that night, it was as if he believed I was complicit in something. As if that blessing had somehow sanctified a crime. Before Miss Marple could respond, there was a commotion outside. Through the window, they could see Constable Briggs hurrying up the path. Reverend, he called, bursting in without ceremony. Inspector Slack wants you at Thornfield House immediately. They found something in the study. The vicar paled. Found what? I couldn't say, sir. But the inspector was very insistent. Miss Marple rose. Perhaps I should come too. Mrs. Harrington might appreciate the support. The constable looked uncertain, but didn't object, and soon they were all making their way to Thornfield House through the steady drizzle. They found Inspector Slack in the study, looking grimly triumphant. The room had been thoroughly searched, books pulled from shelves, cushions removed from chairs. On the desk lay several items, carefully tagged. Ah, Reverend, the inspector said. Good of you to come. Perhaps you can explain this. He held up a photograph, old and slightly faded. It showed 4 people standing before what appeared to be an art gallery. Charles Harrington, Martin Ashford, a man Miss Marple didn't recognize, and the Reverend himself, looking much younger. Yes, that was taken in London. Charles invited me to a gallery opening. The man on the end is Oliver Carstairs, the dealer who later killed himself. Yes, the vicar took it with trembling hands, read it, and went white. This is impossible. I never received this letter. And this. The inspector produced another item, a letter in faded ink, found hidden behind the backing of a picture frame. It's addressed to you, Reverend. What does it say? Miss Marple asked. The silence in the room was deafening. The Reverend sank into a chair, his face in his hands. I never saw this letter, he repeated. I swear before God, I never saw it. If I had known, Inspector Slack took it back. It's from Carstairs, dated the day before his death. He writes, the game is up. M knows everything about the copies. Sir says you're prepared to testify to their authenticity if needed. For God's sake, don't. Your collar won't protect you if this comes out. Destroy this and deny everything. Known what, exactly? Inspector Slack pressed. That you'd given religious authenticity to forged paintings? That your blessing was used to convince buyers? The evidence suggests otherwise. The inspector's voice was cold, and it gives you quite a motive for murder, doesn't it? Martin Ashford returns, threatens to expose your part in the fraud. But that's monstrous. I would never. Inspector, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Might I look at that photograph again? How interesting, she murmured. Do you see what's in the background? Just visible through the gallery window? He handed it over impatiently. Miss Marple studied it carefully, then noticed something that made her draw in her breath. Everyone crowded around to look. There, reflected in the glass, was another figure, someone standing across the street, watching, probably just a passerby. The inspector dismissed, perhaps. But look at the way everyone in the photograph is positioned. They're all turned slightly, as if aware of being watched, and Mr. Carstairs seems to be gesturing, warning someone off perhaps. She handed the photograph back, but her mind was racing. Inspector, where exactly did you find these items? And was it locked? Hidden compartment in the desk. Very cleverly concealed. We almost missed it. No, oddly enough, the mechanism was broken. Looked like it had been forced recently. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. So someone else knew about this hiding place. Someone who perhaps came looking for these very items. You mean the murderer? Or perhaps Mr. Ashford himself? Tell me, Inspector, have you examined the window I mentioned yesterday? Inspector Slack looked annoyed at the change of subject. Yes, there were some scuff marks on the sill. Could have been from someone climbing in, or could have been there for months. But the window was definitely opened from the inside. Miss Marple turned to survey the room, her gaze lingering on the spot where Martin's body had been found. Something about the scene still bothered her. Something beyond the obvious questions of who and why. Appeared to be. Yes. Then she saw it, or rather didn't see it. Inspector, what happened to Mr. Ashford's jacket? His jacket? When we found him yesterday, he was in his shirt sleeves. But it was quite cool, and he'd been wearing a jacket earlier when he confronted Mrs. Harrington. Where is it? The inspector frowned, consulting his notes. I don't recall seeing a jacket. A search of the room revealed nothing. Miss Marple walked to the window, examining the view. The study looked out onto a side garden, sheltered from the main house by a row of bushes. Constable, she said suddenly, would you mind checking those rhododendrons? I think you might find something interesting. Constable Briggs looked to his superior, who nodded grudgingly. Minutes later, he returned, triumph on his face and a dark jacket in his hands. Found it pushed right into the middle of the bushes, ma'am. And look, he held it up. The jacket was torn at the shoulder, and there were what looked like rust-colored stains on the sleeve.
Blood,
Inspector Slack said immediately. But whose? And how did it get into the garden? Miss Marple was examining the jacket carefully. Inspector, I think you should look at the inside pocket. He did so, pulling out a folded piece of paper. As he opened it, his expression changed from annoyance to shock. All eyes turned to the window, to the jacket, to the bloodstains that might or might not belong to the victim. It's a letter, he said slowly, from Martin Ashford to Timothy Bellingham, dated last week. He read aloud. The game you and Charles played is over. I have proof of every transaction, every forgery, every pound you helped him hide. Meet me at Thornfield on Tuesday at 4:30, or I go to the police with everything. Tuesday at 4:30, Miss Marple said quietly. But Mr. Ashford was killed closer to 4:45. So the question is, did Mr. Bellingham keep that appointment? And if so, why was the meeting in the study rather than the drawing room where visitors would normally be received? Inspector Slack's face darkened. And you didn't think to mention this yesterday? The Reverend, forgotten in the excitement, suddenly spoke. The study window. Charles always used it when he wanted to come and go without the servants knowing. He showed me once, years ago. There's a trick to opening it from outside. I didn't think of it. So much has happened. Right. The inspector turned to his constable. Bring Timothy Bellingham in for questioning. Immediately. And this time, if he tries to run, arrest him. As the police bustled about their business, Miss Marple lingered in the study. She walked slowly to the desk, where Martin had died, running her fingers along its edge. Fake, she murmured to herself, thinking of that puzzling final message. What if it hadn't been referring to the paintings at all? What if Martin had discovered something else entirely in this room? Something that had cost him his life. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice Rosemary Sinclair watching from the doorway, her face pale and her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles showed white. But someone else noticed. From the garden, barely visible through the still open window, another watcher stood in the shadow of the trees, waiting, planning, and perhaps preparing to kill again. By tea time, the news of Timothy Bellingham's arrest had spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. Miss Marple, returning from Thornfield House, found her parlour unexpectedly occupied by Julia Bellingham, who had apparently let herself in and was pacing before the fireplace like a caged animal. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whirled around, her face desperate. "They've taken Timothy. That horrible inspector says he has evidence, but it's all wrong. All of it." "Do sit down, my dear," Miss Marple said calmly, settling into her own chair. "You'll make yourself ill carrying on like this." Julia collapsed onto the sofa, wringing her hands. He didn't kill Martin Ashford. He couldn't have. Yes, he went to meet him. But when he got there... "When he got there?" Miss Marple prompted gently. She stopped abruptly, colour draining from her face. Without raising an alarm, he knew how it would look. The appointment letter, his history with Charles. "Oh, Miss Marple, they'll hang him for something he didn't do." Julia bit her lip, clearly wrestling with herself. Finally, she burst out. Martin was already dead. Timothy climbed through the window. He knew about it from the old days and found him slumped over the desk. He panicked and ran. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Mrs. Bellingham, I think perhaps you should tell me everything, from the beginning." Julia looked up with tear-filled eyes. "Everything? If you want me to help your husband, yes." For a long moment, Julia stared at her hands. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began, "Timothy wasn't just Charles Harrington's accomplice. He was his victim." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her hands stilled on her needles. "Charles had a hold over him," Julia continued. "You see, when Timothy was very young, just starting at the bank, he made a mistake, approved a loan without proper authorization. The client defaulted, and Timothy faced ruin. Charles stepped in, covered the loss, saved Timothy's career, but from then on, he owned him." Miss Marple finished quietly. "Yes, every questionable transaction, every forged provenance, every hidden transfer, Charles made Timothy handle it all. And Timothy, terrified of exposure, did as he was told. Even after Charles died, we weren't free. Beatrice knew, you see. She kept us under her thumb with the threat of revelation. And then Martin returned." Julia nodded miserably. "Timothy thought it was over. That's why he was trying to leave yesterday. Not from guilt, but from despair. He knew Martin would expose everything, and no one would believe he'd been coerced." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "The envelope you had this morning at the vicarage, may I ask what it contained?" Julia started. "How did you?" "Oh, what does it matter now?" She pulled the envelope from her purse. "It's from Switzerland. Timothy wrote to the bank there, trying to get records from 15 years ago. He thought if he could prove Charles was the mastermind." She handed over the letter. It was in German, but included what appeared to be transaction records. Miss Marple studied them thoughtfully. "These dates," she murmured. "They're from after Martin supposedly died." "Yes, that's what Timothy realized. Charles continued making deposits for months after Martin's death was reported. Why would he do that if Martin was really dead?" An interesting question indeed, Miss Marple thought. She was about to respond when there was a knock at the door. It was Rosemary Sinclair, looking distraught. "Come in, child," Miss Marple said kindly. "Mrs. Bellingham was just leaving." "I'm so sorry to intrude," she said, glancing nervously at Julia. "But I had to speak to someone, and Aunt Beatrice is indisposed." Julia rose reluctantly. "You will help, won't you, Miss Marple? You'll find out who really killed Martin." "I'll do my best," Miss Marple assured her. When Julia had gone, Rosemary sank into the vacated seat. She looked terrible, dark circles under her eyes, her usually neat appearance disheveled. "I can't bear it any more," she said without preamble. "The secrets, the lies, everyone pretending they don't know things they clearly do. And now Uncle Martin is dead, and Timothy's been arrested, and it's all my fault. I saw him, the real murderer. At least, I think I did. Rosemary twisted her hands together. But if I tell the police, it will all come out. And I can't face that. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. Your fault. My dear, Miss Marple said gently. Whatever your secret, surely it's not worth protecting a murderer. Rosemary laughed bitterly. You don't understand. It's not my secret I'm protecting. She took a shuddering breath. I'm not really Charles Harrington's goddaughter. I'm his daughter. In the silence that followed, the ticking of the mantel clock seemed unnaturally loud. And Martin knew? I see, Miss Marple said finally. And your mother, a woman in London, an artist's model. She died when I was 12. That part was true. Charles brought me here, but Beatrice, she only agreed on the condition that no one ever knew the truth. She couldn't bear the scandal, you see. The perfect Charles Harrington, with an illegitimate child. He found out somehow. That's what they argued about, all those years ago. Martin said Charles had no right to hide me away, to deny me my birthright, but Charles was adamant. I was to be the ward, nothing more. Miss Marple absorbed this revelation, fitting it into the growing puzzle. You said you saw the murderer. Rosemary nodded, tears starting to fall. I was in the morning room, watching for Timothy to leave. I wanted to make sure he was gone before I went to Uncle Martin. But then I saw someone else go around to the study window, someone in a dark coat with the hood up. Did you recognize them? I'm not sure. They moved like someone I know, but I couldn't see their face. And then, maybe 10 minutes later, I saw them leave the same way. They were moving quickly, almost running. And you didn't raise an alarm? Rosemary flushed. I assumed it was Timothy, keeping his appointment. It wasn't until later, when we found Uncle Martin, that I realized. Miss Marple leaned forward. Rosemary, this is very important. Think carefully. Was there anything distinctive about this person? Height, build, the way they walked. Rosemary closed her eyes, concentrating. They were average height, maybe a bit shorter, and they had a slight limp favoring their left leg. I remember thinking it was odd, because Timothy doesn't limp. A few minutes after, I heard the clock chime the half hour just before I saw them. A slight limp. Miss Marple filed this information away. And you're certain about the timing? This was which meant, Miss Marple reflected, that either Timothy Bellingham had lied about finding Martin already dead, or there had been two visitors to that study within minutes of each other. Rosemary, she said carefully, have you told anyone else about being Charles's daughter? Only one person, someone I trusted. Someone who promised to help me claim my inheritance after Aunt Beatrice. She trailed off, horror dawning in her eyes. Oh God, you don't think... But they wouldn't. They couldn't. Before Miss Marple could ask who they were, there was a commotion outside. Through the window, they could see Inspector Slack's car pulling up, followed by another police vehicle. The inspector himself stood on her doorstep, looking harassed. Miss Marple, I need you to come with me. There's been a development. Now what? Miss Marple murmured, going to the door. What sort of development? Timothy Bellingham has confessed, but he hesitated, clearly reluctant to continue. He's also claiming he saw someone else at Thornfield House. Someone who shouldn't have been there. That's just it. He won't say. Says he needs to speak to you first. Privately. The inspector's expression showed what he thought of this request. I told him it was irregular, but he insists he'll only tell you. Who? Miss Marple reached for her coat. Then we'd better not keep him waiting. As they drove toward the police station, Miss Marple noticed Rosemary hadn't moved from her chair, staring into space with an expression of growing horror. Whatever secret she'd been about to reveal would have to wait. At the station, Timothy Bellingham looked haggard, but determined. He sat in the small interview room, hands folded on the table, and barely glanced at Inspector Slack. Thank you for coming, Miss Marple, he said quietly. I need to tell someone the truth, and you're the only person in this village who might believe me. I'm listening, Mr. Bellingham. He took a deep breath. I did go to meet Martin, just as the letter said. I climbed through the study window. I was afraid of meeting Beatrice if I went to the front door, but when I got there, Martin was already dead. So your wife said. Timothy's eyes widened. Julia told you? But I made her promise. She's trying to save you, Mr. Bellingham. Now, who else did you see? The painting, Timothy said simply. The one in the church. Martin had discovered something about it. Something that changed everything. That's why he wrote fake. Not about the forgeries, but about something else entirely. Something much worse. Timothy was quiet for a long moment. Then, I can't say, not yet. But I can tell you this. Martin wasn't killed for the reasons everyone thinks. It wasn't about the forgeries or the money. Then what was it about? Mr. Bellingham, Inspector Slack interrupted impatiently. If you know who killed Martin Ashford, you must tell us. Timothy looked at Miss Marple, desperation in his eyes. Go to the church, he said urgently. Look at the painting Charles donated. Really look at it. Then you'll understand why I can't speak. Why Martin had to die. Why we're all in danger now. This is ridiculous, the inspector began. But Miss Marple held up a hand. As Miss Marple left the police station, her mind was racing. A painting in the church. A victim who needed protecting. A secret worth killing for. I'll go, she said quietly. But Mr. Bellingham, if you're protecting a murderer, I'm not protecting them, Timothy said bitterly. I'm protecting their victim. The person Martin was really here to save. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer who might not be finished yet. The sun was setting as she made her way toward the church, painting the sky blood red. How appropriate, she thought grimly. Because she had the feeling that before this was over, more blood would be spilled. The question was, could she prevent it in time? The interior of St. Mary Mead's church was dim in the fading light, dust motes dancing in the colored beams from the stained glass windows. Miss Marple made her way to the vestry, where the Reverend Harcourt had said the donated painting hung. She found it easily enough, a Renaissance scene depicting the Annunciation, the Virgin Mary receiving news from the angel Gabriel. It was beautiful work, the colors still vibrant, despite its apparent age. A small brass plaque read, "Donated by Charles Harrington, in loving memory of his father." Miss Marple studied it carefully, wondering what Timothy Bellingham expected her to see. The composition was traditional, the brushwork skilled, and yet beautiful, isn't it? She turned to find Oliver Pemberton, the church warden, standing in the doorway. A tall, spare man in his 60s. He had a slight limp from an old hunting accident, a limp favoring his left leg. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, watching him carefully. I understand it's been here for quite some time. You were close to the Harrington brothers? 15 years, give or take. Pemberton moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the empty vestry. Charles presented it just before Martin left for Africa. I remember the ceremony well. I knew them. Certainly. Charles was very generous to the church. He paused, studying the painting with an odd expression. This piece in particular was his pride and joy. Said it was the finest work in his collection. Miss Marple noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the painting. Mr. Pemberton, were you at home yesterday afternoon? Oh, just wondering. Such a terrible business at Thornfield House. His eyes sharpened. Why do you ask? I was taking my constitutional. I often walk in the afternoons. Good for the leg, you know. He turned away from her scrutiny. Why this sudden interest in the painting, Miss Marple? Before she could answer, they heard footsteps approaching rapidly. Beatrice Harrington appeared in the doorway, breathing hard, her usual composure completely shattered. Oliver, she gasped. Thank God you're here. I've had the most dreadful... Oh, Miss Marple. Mrs. Harrington, whatever is the matter? Beatrice clutched at the doorframe. Someone broke into Thornfield House. The safe in Charles's study. It's been opened. And the documents. Oh God, if the police find them. Documents? Miss Marple asked mildly. Beatrice seemed to realize what she'd said. That is... Both women turned to stare at him. He stood before the painting, his face grave. The adoption papers, Oliver Pemberton said quietly. That's what you're worried about, isn't it, Beatrice? What adoption papers? Miss Marple asked, though she thought she already knew. Rosemary's, Pemberton replied. Except they're not real adoption papers. Are they, Beatrice? They're forgeries. Just like so many other things Charles created. Beatrice went white. How do you? Because I helped create them. He laughed bitterly. Oh yes, Miss Marple. You see before you another of Charles Harrington's accomplices. I was the one who aged the paper, who researched the proper legal language, who made sure everything looked authentic. Because Beatrice asked me to. He looked at Mrs. Harrington with something like pity. She couldn't bear the scandal of Charles's bastard child, but she also couldn't turn the girl away. So we created a fiction orphaned goddaughter, tragic train crash, grieving godparents taking her in. But why? Miss Marple asked. Martin knew from the beginning. He was there when Charles brought the baby home, when Beatrice had her hysterics, when I was called in to help smooth things over. Pemberton moved closer to the painting, running his fingers along the frame. That's what the final argument was about. Martin wanted to acknowledge Rosemary publicly, give her the Harrington name. Charles refused, and Martin found out. Miss Marple said. It wasn't a question. So Charles paid him to disappear, Beatrice said dully. And we all pretended to believe he was dead. Except he wasn't dead, Miss Marple observed, and someone kept sending money to that account in Cape Town. Not Charles. He died 5 years after Martin left. So who continued the payments? Oliver, Beatrice gasped. The silence stretched taut. Finally, Pemberton spoke. I did. I couldn't let him starve, could I? He was my... That is, we were... He stopped, unable to continue, but Miss Marple understood. You were in love with him. Pemberton's face crumbled. From the moment I met him. But it was impossible, of course. A church warden, in love with another man, in a village like this. So I loved him in silence, helped him when Charles drove him away, sent money when I could. The words fell into the vestry like stones, into still water. Beatrice made a small sound of protest, but Pemberton merely smiled sadly, because he was going to destroy everything. Not just expose the forgeries or Rosemary's parentage, but everything. He turned back to the painting. Do you know what this really is, Miss Marple? Then why, Miss Marple asked gently, did you kill him? I'm beginning to suspect. It's not a Renaissance masterpiece. It's not even a good copy. It's an original work, painted by a young artist in London 20 years ago. An artist named Mary Sinclair. Rosemary's mother, Miss Marple breathed. Exactly. Charles commissioned it, pretended it was a discovered masterpiece, sold copies as originals, but this one, the original, he kept. His private joke hanging in a church for all to see. And Martin knew this. He discovered it yesterday. Came here, studied the painting, saw Mary's hidden signature. She always signed her work with a tiny rose, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Pemberton pointed to a corner of the painting, where indeed a minuscule rose was worked into the design. He was ecstatic, Pemberton continued. Said it proved Rosemary's mother was a true artist, not just some model Charles had seduced. He was going to announce it publicly, have the painting authenticated, restore Mary Sinclair's reputation. But that would have exposed everything else, Miss Marple said. The forgeries, the fake adoption, all of it. More than that, Beatrice spoke up, her voice hollow. It would have destroyed Rosemary. She's engaged, you know, to the Ashworth boy, the squire's son. A lovely match, everyone says, but what family would accept her, if they knew? Illegitimate daughter of a forger and his artist mistress. So you decided Martin had to die, Miss Marple said to Pemberton. I didn't decide anything, he protested. I went to reason with him, climbed through that damned window, because I knew he was meeting Timothy, and I wanted to catch him alone. But when I got there, he stopped, his face working with emotion. When you got there, Miss Marple prompted. He was writing everything down about Mary, about Rosemary, about the paintings. He said he'd already sent letters to London, to art dealers, to newspapers. Said it was too late to stop him. Pemberton's voice dropped to a whisper. He was going to destroy the woman I loved most in the world. Rosemary? No. He looked at Beatrice with infinite sadness. You never knew, did you? All these years, and you never guessed how I felt. Beatrice stared at him in shock. Oliver, I loved you from the day Charles brought you home as his bride. Loved you through your marriage, through your widowhood, through all the years of pretending we were just friends. His voice broke. And I couldn't let Martin destroy you. Not when I'd protected you all this time. The letter opener was there. He turned away, dismissing me like I was nothing. And he made a convulsive gesture. It was over in seconds. He slumped forward, and I realized what I'd done. "So you killed him," Miss Marple said quietly. "And the word fake?" He'd already written it, part of his exposé about the paintings. "I left it because I panicked, grabbed his jacket when I heard someone coming, threw it in the garden, and fled." "Someone coming," Miss Marple repeated. "That would have been Timothy Bellingham." "I suppose so." I didn't wait to see. They stood in silence, 3 elderly people in a vestry, with murder between them. Finally, Miss Marple spoke. "Mr. Pemberton, you must go to the police." "Must I?" He smiled sadly. "I've destroyed everything anyway. Beatrice will never forgive me. Rosemary will be ruined when this comes out. And Martin," his voice broke. "Martin died believing I betrayed him all those years ago by helping Charles. He never knew I loved him too. He moved suddenly, faster than his age, and limp should have allowed. Before either woman could stop him, he had wrenched open the vestry door and was gone, his footsteps echoing through the church.